I bought my Zeiss Batis 85mm lens back in 2021, and I wanted to see what the status of the Batis is compared to a more modern video-centric lens. Sony is letting me borrow this lens, which is the 85mm f1.4 GM Mark II, for a couple of weeks. Actually, I have to send it back later today after I finish this part of the video. And my question really is this lens better than this lens for video, which I think that it is, but does it maintain the, I guess, 3D pop effect of an 85mm lens, especially the Zeiss, which is known to have some pretty cool character to it? And I don't know that I can accurately describe what I mean by 3D pop. I don't know if that's a technical term, but it's just something that kind of describes the way everything really does seem to kind of leap out of the images from the Zeiss 85 that I've used. And I primarily use this for B-roll footage. That's where it fits into my workflow. Is I do a lot of product shots and I use this for tons of B-roll. I don't normally use it for talking head stuff because even though it looks great, look at this beautiful background blur, I have to keep the camera so far away in order to not be, you know, too cropped in. So for a small space like this, 85mm is tough. But once I need to do product shots and I need to do close-ups, this lens works a lot of magic, but it's also not perfect. So this is the Sony right now. You're looking at me on the Sony. I'm going to switch over to the Zeiss. And now you're looking at me on the Zeiss Batis, the Zeiss to be precise. I did have to change the Sony. Big benefit here is that it is an f1.4 lens. This is an f1.8 lens, which is still very, very fast. So I did have to stop down to f1.8 when I switched. And I did boost the ISO a little bit. So just to kind of compensate for that. So those are the differences there, but it's still 85mm. I haven't done a talking head side by side. I filmed some comparison footage between these two lenses where you can kind of see the difference or the lack thereof between them, but I haven't done talking head differences. So it's interesting. It will be interesting to see in a studio environment what this looked like compared to the beginning of the video where I was using the Sony lens. Now, a while back, I did make a dedicated video all about the 85mm focal length in particular, which is not really about a specific lens, but it's just about kind of the magic of 85, not just because I was born in 85, but because the 85 focal length. It's something that I did not get until many, many years after I got my first camera, and I wish I had dove into it sooner because there's a lot to explore there and it gives you a lot that you just can't get with other lenses. Even if you get close, you know, like a 50mm lens is really nice. 85 has something very, very special to it, and it's wonderful for portraits. It's wonderful for human and animal subjects. We do birthday photos of our dogs every year with it. But it's also fantastic in my world, like I said, for product B-roll, because my cameras have 4K 120 on the A7S III and the FX3 over here. I'm able to put my 85mm lens on the camera and I can do handheld product B-roll shots. I can get handheld thumbnail images. It's been hugely helpful for my workflow that involves a lot of product and gear-based imagery. But it hasn't been perfect. I've had my Zeiss, this lens, for a while now, and so I've learned some of its quirks. The biggest one being it was released in 2015, so it is not a new lens. The Sony, on the other hand, was released in 2024. It is a very new lens by comparison, and lenses are not updated nearly as often as like a phone or something anyway. So the lens from 2015 still optically looks wonderful, and I zero complaints about how this looks optically. Where I do have issues is with the focus, especially for video. I have found that for photos, the focus of the Zeiss lens is great. If I'm just doing a still photo, it'll find the subject, bloop, no problem, take the photo. For video, it can kind of struggle. Hopefully it's not hunting too much on me. It looks like it's locked in there, but what I have noticed when I do product-based stuff, especially I select my subject and then I try to move the camera around and track it, and so many times the camera keeps kind of hunting and pulsing that I can't use that shot. You can kind of see in this example here, it's actually from my MacBook Pro review from a while back, but you can see the Apple logo. The camera just keeps hunting for focus, and it's not a clip that I could actually use in the review, even though it's a great looking shot. And sometimes, especially if I'm using the smaller screen on the cameras themselves, it can be hard to tell that that's happening until I have the footage on my computer, and then I realize some of my favorite shots actually aren't usable. So what I've been doing really for the past couple of years when I use this lens is primarily using it in manual focus for video. I put on peaking on my camera so I can see what's in focus, and I very carefully try to plan my moves so that the object stays in focus, And that works well because it gives me the image quality and I don't worry about the focus issues. But it's also kind of complicated to always have to use manual focus when I know my cameras have great autofocus and I should just be able to tap on the subject and track it no matter where I move the camera. And that's where this lens, the 85mm GM Mark II, comes into play, because it has all the optical quality of an 85mm lens that you would want, but it has way better autofocus motors geared specifically towards video. And I've definitely found that to be the case in my like test example shots here. I can put, you know, my old Canon XL1 and I just have to tap on a part of the camera and I can move the lens around and it stays in focus. And that makes sense because when this lens was released, cameras didn't even really have good autofocus for video. So you were using manual focus anyway, but more than a decade later at this point, autofocus for video is a thing that people expect, and that is very, very helpful. And the other areas that the Sony lens is better than the Zeiss lens is with all the physical controls. So if you've used a G Master lens before, this is very similar to like the 24mm that I'm filming on right here. I have manual controls for everything. There's a physical switch for autofocus and manual focus. There's a physical switch for an iris lock if I want to lock in my aperture, because there is an aperture ring. So I can do that and I can lock it in so now it won't change. And there's also a way to de-click the aperture. So if I want this to be smooth or if I want this to be kind of clicked, I can do that however I want, or I can just set it to automatic, which is, well, not automatic, but it would be controlled by the camera instead of controlled by the lens. And then you also have two customizable buttons. So I like to set these to things like putting the grid on screen. So that way, like if I want my like framing grid, that'll go on screen, or turning focus peaking on or off. That's a lot of versatility built into this in addition to your focus ring. The Zeiss lens has a focus ring. That's all the physical controls it has. It does have a very nifty little LCD screen, so this doesn't have anything to kind of like indicate my focus distance or anything, but there's a little LCD screen on the Zeiss lens that will kind of tell you like where you're at in terms of focusing. And that is helpful, especially if you want to know the distance between your subject, or the minimum focusing distance is 2.9 feet, which is almost a meter. So if you kind of know that and you set it so it's at 2.9, then you kind of know how close you need to be away from something. I was curious to see if this had a closer minimum focusing distance, and it doesn't. Maybe slightly, but not in a way that's noticeable. So I'm not able to like use the 85mm focal length in a different way in a small space like this. It's kind of the same as my other lens. And the other thing that I was hoping is, with 85mm, you can kind of see it here. They can blur the background into oblivion, and so that's a beautiful quality of it. But if you have a closer foreground object and a really far background object, and you're focused on the background, your foreground object almost becomes invisible. Like the lens is just seeing through it entirely. And if that happens, especially if you're trying to just tap to focus, the lens will basically never find the subject and be able to focus back on it. I was hoping the Sony would be better at that, but I've actually found it to be the same. So I think that's more of a quality of the 85mm focal length and less about a specific lens. So when I totally lose my subject because I'm like focused way on a far background, then I have to flip the lens into manual and control it this way. Which on the Zeiss lens, since there is no manual control, I have one of my custom keys assigned to autofocus on or off, and so I have to push that button on the camera, and then I can control the Zeiss lens manually. And then looking at my notes, there's a couple other points to bring up when looking between these two lenses, because the first one is going to be price. If you want an 85mm lens for your Sony camera system and you look at these two lenses, they're both going to be very highly rated, but you're going to see one, the Zeiss over here, has a current retail price of $1,249. That's actually more than I paid for it a few years ago, but in this economy, whereas the retail price for the Sony lens is $2,049. So that is $800 more expensive. Do I think this lens is $1,000 better than the Zeiss lens? No, it's not, but it is a better lens. But of course that always does depend on your needs, and that's totally just my opinion. If you're doing primarily photos, I think both lenses could be great because their autofocus works great. If you're doing video, that's where you're going to feel the age of the Zeiss very quickly if you don't want to work in manual focus most of the time, especially if you're tracking non-human, non-animal, non-living subjects. So in addition to the price differences and the lack of manual controls on the Zeiss, there are optical differences. Like I mentioned, the Sony goes to f1.4, so it's very, very wide. I'm at 1.4 right here. I love that. And it also has 14 lens elements with 11 aperture blades. The Zeiss has 11 elements with 9 blades. So right now we're at f1.8. Look at the background, look at the amount of background blur and just sort of see the quality there. And I'll switch back to the Sony, which has more aperture blades, and see if you notice any difference. And now this is the Sony lens. I kept the aperture at f1.8 with the exact same ISO so you can see sort of the difference there. You kind of don't think there would be much of a difference between f1.8 and f1.4, but there totally is. So this is f1.8 and this is f1.4 with a slightly lower aperture as well. So there's a difference. There's more background blur, more background compression, more background blur, but it's a really nice looking image. 85 millimeters, no matter what lens you use, is just a really, really nice looking image. But you saw a lot of me on the Zeiss lens for a talking head using a human subject in the first part of this video. And now you can kind of look at what the Sony is like. Both lenses were using autofocus to track me. So do you notice any difference between how the Zeiss was tracking me when I was sitting here? I'm not moving a lot, but I'm moving normally. Do you notice difference between how this lens was tracking me to that one? Because that could kind of tell you, is the focus hunting or not? I have found the Zeiss to be pretty decent when you're tracking a slow moving human subject. That might just be because of my cameras, because they have really good autofocus and they can track subject eyes very quickly. They can realize where the eyes lies. And I think the lens has an easier time, but when it comes to inanimate objects, products and things, that's where the autofocus has let me down a lot of times, and I've just had to switch to manual focus when using my Zeiss lens. So obviously I recognize that is a pretty niche workflow for a lens, is to do primarily inanimate objects, especially up close at 4K 120. But it is something I do pretty much every time I make a video, and so when there is that friction, not being able to rely on autofocus, you notice it every single time. Is that enough for me to upgrade from this lens, the Zeiss lens, to this lens, the Sony lens? No, it is not. I love this lens. If both of them were sitting on a shelf and all things were equal and would just take the lens that you want, I would probably take the Sony lens because I do a lot of video and it's better for video. But I don't think it is almost $1,000 better for video. And especially if you already have an 85, at least for me, I've just been working with manual focus and that's been fine overall. Fine enough to save the $800+ at least. But the other part of my question has to do with not just image quality, like the technical pixel peeping sharpness, like do we do edge for edge things and I film a whole bunch of charts and stuff and you see how those charts look. I don't really care about that. I care about what the actual quality looks like. And something about the Zeiss lens, it's a great lens. It is not a perfect lens, but the imperfect nature of this lens, especially in all the years since its release, has really kind of become more of its character rather than a negative. And this lens does have really special character to it. Despite my struggles with autofocus, the number of times I've gotten clips that I'm just like, I can't believe how good this looks. When I've used it for photos and portraits and stuff, the number of times I've seen stuff that are just like, I can't believe I took that photo. Like, it looks so good. Whereas the Sony lens, what they're known for, the GM lenses are known for, the word I've read in a lot of reviews is clinical. So they're very technically precise, technically sharp, much more technically correct, which is, you know, arguably a very good thing. But how you feel about that, how you feel about the quality between the two different lenses, you know, that's going to sort of change which one works for you and which one doesn't. To be totally honest, going through the footage of this, because I'm filming this part of the video, this talking head part right here, this is the last thing, and then I need to put this lens in a box and send it back to Sony. I've had the lens for a couple weeks. I've been filming other stuff and using things with it and explaining it. So all the B-roll you're seeing was filmed before this. But the thing that I have thought is, do I notice a difference? Do I notice a difference between these two lenses? And I don't. I think if you sat there and you freeze framed and you magnifying glass over everything, you're going to notice some differences just in pure image quality. But I've had to be so careful about organizing my footage, especially if I film like the same thing. Like, I'll take this lens and film, a shot of an old camera. Now I'll take the Zeiss lens and film a shot of an old camera. I need to make sure I know which shot is which. So I've had to like label stuff and make sure everything is correct and be very careful with my folders, because if I've had two shots next to each other, I can't tell the difference between the lenses, which is a great thing, right? Especially if you want the less expensive lens or the lens you already got, turns out you're not missing out on like a whole world of quality just because you don't have the newer, more expensive lens, but the newer, more expensive lens does have a lot to offer and does offer that extra stop of aperture because you go all the way to f1.4, which is cool. So I've been looking at these comparison shots for a while, and I would really like to know your thoughts on them because you can probably see things in a different way than I can. You're watching on a different screen than I'm using. I'm really curious if you notice, especially with like YouTube's compression and stuff, is there a difference between the Zeiss footage and the Sony footage? Is there a preference towards one or the other? Or do you have experience with one, both, or a totally different 85mm lens that's worth checking out? And if you don't know about 85mm, check out my full video on that. And if you don't know about lenses, because I've been talking about aperture and all this stuff, and like, what the heck are those words you're saying? I do have an entire starter guide to figure out how to find the lens that's right for you. If it's a world that just feels a little bit overwhelming and confusing, this will help simplify it.